Last year, when I went to a science conference, I wasn't looking for anything life-changing. Just another hall, white walls, bad coffee, people talking in confident sentences. That's where I met him. An old professor, late 70s maybe, wrinkled hands, bright eyes. He wasn't surrounded by students. He wasn't giving a keynote. He was standing alone next to a poster that almost no one was stopping to read. I stopped only because he looked excited. Not proud, not arrogant. Excited, like a child who can't wait to tell you something. I asked him casually, "Is this your project?" He turned toward me instantly. "Yes, and no one is listening." I smiled. "What's it about?" He leaned closer, lowered his voice, not because it was secret, but because it mattered. "I'm trying to understand why people still misunderstand evolution after all this time." That surprised me. "Still?" I said. "I thought that debate was over." He laughed, not loudly, more like someone who's heard that sentence too many times. That's the problem. People think evolution is about the past. I waited. He pointed at the crowd around us. They think it's about fossils, or monkeys, or arguments on the internet. Then he tapped his chest lightly. This is about this, right now. I felt something shift. I asked him, "So what do people get wrong?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked me a question. "Do you think nature is fair?" I hesitated. I mean, no, but... He raised a finger gently. That hesitation, that's where the misunderstanding begins. We found 2 empty chairs and sat down. He told me something strange. Most people believe survival is about strength, or intelligence, or effort. He shook his head. Nature doesn't care how hard you try. That sentence stayed with me. He continued, survival is about fitting just enough into the moment you're born into. Not greatness, not destiny, just fitting. I said, that sounds depressing. He smiled again. Only if you're attached to the idea that life owes you meaning. That's when I realized this wasn't just biology. This was philosophy wearing a lab coat. He leaned back and said quietly, Darwin didn't write a book about animals. He wrote a book about change, about randomness, about adaptation, about why comfort never lasts, about why success expires, about why nothing stays optimized for long. I looked around the conference hall again, people chasing certainty, chasing answers, chasing control. And suddenly, evolution didn't feel like an old theory. It felt like a mirror. Before we stood up, I asked him one last question. Why does this still matter? He didn't hesitate. Because the moment you think evolution stopped, you stop noticing what's shaping you. We shook hands, and I walked away thinking, maybe the origin of species isn't about where we came from. Maybe it's about why we're never done becoming. Sit back, my friend. Take a breath. You're listening to Wise Alchemy. Let's begin. I kept walking after that conversation, but the professor's words didn't follow me the way inspiration usually does. They followed me the way a doubt does. Quiet, persistent. And that's when the other voice showed up. You're romanticizing this, it said. Evolution is settled science, We learned it in school. Animals adapt, species change. End of story. I nodded unconsciously, as if agreeing with myself. That voice sounded reasonable. We don't live in jungles anymore. We live in cities, with technology, with laws, with choices. Comparing humans today to animals fighting for survival feels outdated. That argument is everywhere. It's the same tone people use when they say, human nature doesn't matter anymore. Culture is stronger than biology. We're beyond all that primitive stuff. And for a moment, it almost made sense. So I let the voice talk. Look around, it said. People aren't adapting to nature. Nature adapts to people. Skyscrapers, medicine, climate control, global systems. Survival isn't the issue anymore. I stopped walking. Because that sentence sounded powerful, but something about it felt wrong. Not emotionally wrong, logically wrong. So I asked the voice something simple. If survival isn't the issue anymore, why do people feel more anxious than ever? Why does failure feel like death? Why does losing relevance feel worse than losing money? Why does everyone feel like they're running, but no one knows from what? The skeptical voice paused, then adjusted. That's social pressure, it said. Competition, economics, capitalism. Okay, but competition is older than capitalism. Pressure is older than governments. And fear of falling behind didn't start with smartphones. So I pushed again. Why does comparison hurt so much? Why do we instinctively measure ourselves against others? Why does status matter even when we pretend it doesn't? Why does rejection still feel physical? The voice tried a different angle. That's psychology. Yes, but psychology didn't appear out of thin air. Psychology is a consequence, a layer built on something deeper. And this is where people misunderstand evolution. They think evolution is about bones and fossils, teeth and claws. But that's just the visible part. Evolution is about patterns that survive. And patterns don't disappear just because the environment changes. They adapt, quietly. The professor's voice returned in my memory. When the environment changes faster than biology, behavior becomes the battlefield. That's when it hit me. We didn't escape evolution. We changed the arena. We don't fight predators anymore. We fight irrelevance, instability, uncertainty, being left behind. Our ancestors competed for food. We compete for meaning, for position, for visibility. And systems, companies, cultures, ideologies, they behave like environments now. They select, they reward, they discard. The skeptical voice softened again. So you're saying we're still evolving? Not physically, not in the way people imagine, but in behavior, in norms, in what traits are rewarded, in what traits disappear. And here's the uncomfortable part Darwin hinted at, without ever talking about social media, careers, or modern anxiety. Evolution doesn't care if the trait feels good. It only cares if it survives. Restlessness survives well. Ambition spreads easily. Comparison multiplies. Stillness doesn't. Contentment doesn't. Silence doesn't. The skeptical voice went quiet. Not defeated, just thoughtful. And that's when I realized why the origin of species still matters. Not because it explains animals, but because it explains why systems change people, while people believe they're making free choices. Darwin didn't give us a comforting story. He gave us a dangerous lens. One that says, if something keeps repeating across time, cultures, and systems, it's probably not an accident. And if we don't understand that, we'll keep thinking our stress is personal failure, our restlessness is lack of discipline, our dissatisfaction is ungratefulness, instead of recognizing it as adaptation pressure. So no, this isn't a story about finches or islands. It's a story about what happens when selection moves from nature into society, and whether we notice it or let it shape us silently. I kept thinking about what the professor said long after we parted ways, not because it sounded dramatic, but because it was quiet. The kind of idea that doesn't argue with you. It just sits there, waiting for you to notice how often it shows up. A few days later, I caught myself watching people in a cafe. Nothing unusual. A group laughing loudly at the center table, a quiet couple in the corner, someone alone, scrolling, pretending not to look around. And suddenly, the thought hit me. Why does this scene feel so familiar? Different city, different people, different country even. Same patterns. Why does every group, no matter how modern or progressive, quietly organize itself the same way? Someone speaks more, someone listens more, someone leads without being asked, someone fades into the background without permission. No one announces it, no one plans it, it just happens. And that's when the skeptical voice inside me woke up. Come on, you're overthinking this. Humans are complex, free, creative. I wanted to believe that, but then I asked myself something uncomfortable. If we're so free, why do our choices look so similar? Think about it. Every culture values certain traits: confidence, competence, attractiveness, status, influence. The names change, the rules change, the platforms change, but the rewards? Strangely consistent. Even systems designed to erase hierarchy end up recreating it in new forms. Schools, workplaces, online communities, even friend groups. Someone always rises, someone always struggles, someone always adapts faster. And it's never random for long. We like to say it is, because random feels fair, but randomness doesn't repeat itself this cleanly. So what's really happening? Here's the part that made me uneasy. We feel like we're choosing careers, choosing partners, choosing lifestyles, choosing values. But we rarely choose what feels rewarding. That part arrives preloaded. Approval feels good before we understand why. Rejection hurts before we give it meaning. Winning excites us before we attach morals to it. The brain doesn't wait for philosophy, it reacts. And then we build stories around those reactions. I want this. I believe in that. This matters to me. But underneath, there's a quieter process deciding what sticks and what fades. Not consciously, not maliciously, just efficiently. This is where the professor's idea started making more sense. He wasn't talking about destiny or control or some grand plan. He was talking about selection. Not someone selecting, not a god, not a government, just outcomes that survive. Behaviors that work spread. Behaviors that don't disappear. No announcement, no ceremony. A habit that gets rewarded stays alive. One that doesn't slowly vanishes. Think about language. Words survive because they're useful. Phrases die because they aren't. No one votes them out. They just stop being spoken. Now imagine that process happening to ideas, to habits, to ways of living. Quietly, relentlessly. So are we just predictable? This is where the skeptical voice came back stronger. So what? We're just machines running patterns? No, and that's important. Predictability doesn't mean meaninglessness. It means constraint. A river flows freely, but not anywhere at once. Its freedom exists within the shape of the land. And humans? We flow within invisible banks: biology, environment, reward systems, fear of loss. Understanding that doesn't shrink life. It explains why life keeps colliding with the same walls. I think this is why people resist it, because if patterns shape us, then success isn't purely virtue, failure isn't purely laziness, and morality isn't always intention. That's uncomfortable. It removes the clean lines, the heroes and villains, the simple stories. It suggests something colder, but also more honest. That order can emerge without intention, that meaning can grow without design, that systems don't need awareness to shape lives. And this is where Darwin quietly enters, not with animals, not with fossils, not with finches, but with a dangerous observation: that nature doesn't plan, yet still produces structure. That repetition doesn't require purpose, only persistence. And once you really see that, you stop asking, "Who decided this?" and start asking, "What keeps surviving?" That question doesn't just apply to species. It applies to behaviors, to beliefs, to societies, to you. And once that question takes root, there's no going back. I remembered the professor's last words again. He didn't say humans were trapped. He said, "We're shaped long before we feel shaped." And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not that patterns exist, but that we usually notice them only after they've already chosen us. I remember thinking something very naive after that conference. Okay, but Darwin was talking about animals, plants, beaks, claws, not us. That's the mental escape route we all take. We place evolution safely in forests and textbooks, far away from cafes, careers, love, and anxiety. Because the moment we admit it applies to us, things get uncomfortable. Very fast. Most people imagine Darwin like this: an old man studying birds, writing about nature, explaining where animals came from. That's harmless. But that's not what made his idea dangerous. What made it dangerous was this: he removed intention. No grand designer tweaking outcomes, no plan aiming for improvement, no moral direction. Just variation and survival. That's it. And when you really sit with that, you realize something unsettling. If a process can create eyes, wings, and intelligence without wanting to, what else might it be shaping without asking permission? But humans are different, right? Here comes the skeptical voice again. We have culture, language, art, ethics. True. But culture doesn't replace selection. It becomes another environment where selection happens. Think about ideas. Thousands appear every day. Most die quietly. A few survive, spread, get repeated, become common sense. Not because they're true, not because they're good, but because they fit. Fit attention, fit fear, fit reward systems, fit the moment. That's not philosophy. That's selection. Darwin didn't say the strongest survive. He said something far more subtle. The ones that fit the environment survive. Strength can help. Intelligence can help. Morality can help. But none of them guarantee survival. Only fit does. And fit changes. That's the terrifying part. A few weeks after the conference, I caught myself scrolling late at night. You know the feeling. Not enjoying it. Not learning anything. Just scrolling. Then I stopped and thought, why this app? Why this content? Why this behavior? I didn't choose it logically. It chose me by rewarding me. Tiny hits of novelty, recognition, outrage, hope. And suddenly, Darwin wasn't in the jungle anymore. He was in my pocket. Here's something Darwin understood that we still resist. Selection doesn't care. It doesn't hate. It doesn't love. It doesn't judge. It simply removes what doesn't persist. That's why this process feels cruel, even though it has no intention. A trait fails, it disappears. A behavior costs too much, it fades. A way of thinking doesn't spread, it dies quietly. No apology. And when this happens to ideas or people, we call it unfair, because it messes with how we explain success and failure. If survival is about fit, then being right doesn't guarantee winning. Being kind doesn't guarantee thriving. Being smart doesn't guarantee safety. And that shakes something deep inside us. We want the world to reward intention. But Darwin showed us a world that rewards outcomes. Once you see this, you stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What environment am I in?" Not morally, not emotionally, structurally. What behaviors does this system reward? What traits does it punish? What survives here? That question changes everything. Careers, relationships, ideas, even self-esteem. So, are we just victims of environments? No. But we are shaped by them long before we judge them. Freedom doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder. Because freedom begins with seeing the forces at work. Darwin didn't reduce humans. He humbled them. He showed us that complexity can arise without meaning, and that meaning must be built after, not assumed. That's not depressing. That's honest. And honesty is where real agency begins. The professor was right about one thing. Once you stop seeing life as designed, you stop asking who's in charge, and start asking what keeps surviving. And that question changes how you see yourself. I remember feeling slightly uneasy after he said it. Selection doesn't care about fairness. At first, it sounded obvious, almost trivial. Of course nature isn't fair. Everyone knows that. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized how deeply we pretend otherwise. Because nearly everything about modern life is built on the assumption that outcomes mean something moral. We grow up hearing phrases like, "You get what you deserve." "Hard work always pays off." "If they failed, they must have done something wrong." These ideas don't come from biology. They come from our need for order. They make the world feel predictable, safe, understandable. But evolution doesn't work that way. It doesn't reward effort. It doesn't reward intention. It doesn't even reward consistency. It rewards fit, moment by moment. The professor gave me an example. He said, "Take intelligence. We like to think intelligence guarantees success. But intelligence only works when the environment values it. A brilliant thinker in a society that rewards obedience will struggle. A thoughtful person in a brutal system may be crushed. A cautious mind in a fast-moving world may fall behind. Same trait, different outcome. No moral meaning attached. Because once you accept this, you have to let go of a comforting lie, that life is a fair test. It's not a test, it's a shifting landscape. And landscapes don't grade you. I asked him, then why do we keep judging people by results? He said, because uncertainty terrifies us. If success means virtue, then failure feels avoidable. If winners are superior, then losers can be blamed. That belief protects us. It tells us, if I follow the rules, I'll be safe. But nature never promised safety. Here's the subtle mistake we make. We confuse causes with credit. Yes, effort matters. Yes, choices matter. But they don't act alone. Timing matters. Luck matters. Context matters. Invisible variables matter. Selection compresses all of that into one visible outcome, and we mistake that outcome for truth. Think about how often people say, "They just didn't try hard enough." That sentence carries a hidden violence. It erases context. It erases constraints. It erases randomness. It turns complexity into blame. Selection doesn't blame. Humans do. But if we stop judging outcomes, don't we lose standards? No, we lose arrogance. Standards are useful. Moral superiority is not. You can value discipline without shaming those who fall. You can admire success without dehumanizing failure. After that conversation, I noticed something change in me. I stopped comparing timelines. I stopped assuming that if someone was ahead, they were better. And more importantly, I stopped treating my own setbacks as proof of inadequacy. Sometimes the environment just isn't built for you. That doesn't mean you're defective. It means you're misaligned. Evolution explains. It does not excuse. This is important. Understanding selection does not mean excusing harm. Cruelty isn't justified because it worked. Exploitation isn't noble because it was profitable. Selection explains how outcomes happen, not why they should. Confusing the two is how biology gets misused. Some hear this and think, then nothing matters. That's not what it means. It means meaning is not handed to you by outcomes. You choose values despite outcomes. That's harder, but it's more honest. Once you see selection clearly, you stop asking who deserves this and start asking what conditions produced this. That question opens curiosity instead of judgment. It doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. Selection is blind, but humans don't have to be. We can design environments that reward compassion instead of aggression, depth instead of speed, care instead of extraction. Evolution doesn't care, but we can. That night, I wrote something down so I wouldn't forget it. Survival is not a verdict. Success is not a sentence. Failure is not a confession. They are signals, nothing more. And once you understand that, you stop trying to prove your worth to the system. You start asking whether the system deserves you. We praise adaptation like it's a virtue. We say it with admiration, with approval, with a quiet threat hidden underneath. You need to adapt. The world doesn't owe you comfort. Those who survive learn to adjust. But there's something deeply misleading about how we use that word. Because adaptation in nature has nothing to do with obedience. In the natural world, adaptation is not polite. It's not graceful. It's not even fair. A species adapts because the environment leaves it no choice. The climate shifts, food disappears, predators change, and life responds blindly, slowly, without intention. No one is praised for adapting. No one is blamed for failing. There is no should. There is only pressure and response. Somewhere along the way, we changed adaptation into something moral. We turned it into a test of character. If you struggle, you're told you lack resilience. If you resist, you're labeled difficult. If you break, it's framed as personal failure. The environment is never questioned. Only the individual is. And that's where something goes wrong. There's a crucial distinction we rarely make. Adaptation to reality keeps you alive. Adaptation to systems keeps systems intact. Reality doesn't care how you feel, but systems care very much about predictability. Schedules that ignore circadian rhythms, metrics that reduce intelligence to output, norms that reward sameness over originality. When people fail inside these structures, we don't ask, is this system misaligned with human nature? We ask, why couldn't you handle it? Just adapt sounds harmless, even empowering, but over time, it trains people to do something unnatural, translates suffering into self-blame. You don't sleep, you need better discipline. You feel empty, you should be more grateful. You're exhausted, you're not managing your time properly. The system stays innocent, the individual absorbs the guilt. Adaptation becomes dangerous when it demands less of your behavior and more of your identity. When you're not just adjusting how you work, but silencing how you think. When you're not just changing habits, but shrinking instincts. When curiosity becomes a liability. When slowness becomes laziness. When sensitivity becomes weakness. At that point, adaptation stops being survival. It becomes slow disappearance. Evolution never demanded uniformity. It thrives on variation, on deviation, on difference. The very thing systems try to eliminate is the thing life depends on. Outliers, anomalies, misfits. When everything fits perfectly, evolution stops. And when people fit too well into rigid systems, something similar happens inside them. So why don't people resist? Because resistance is expensive. It costs safety, belonging, stability. It's easier to doubt yourself than challenge a structure that rewards compliance. So people adapt longer than they should, bend further than they can sustain, call exhaustion normal. Until one day, the body speaks louder than language ever did. Burnout, anxiety, numbness, a quiet sense of something is wrong. Maybe the real evolutionary question isn't, can you adapt? But what are you being asked to adapt away from? Your pace? Your limits? Your curiosity? Your need for rest? Your way of making meaning? And who benefits when you do? Because adaptation was never meant to erase you. It was meant to help you survive reality. And the moment adaptation becomes obedience to abstraction, it stops being evolution. It becomes a very polite kind of extinction. There's a phrase almost everyone has heard. We throw it around casually, sometimes proudly, sometimes cruelly. Survival of the fittest. It sounds harsh, like a verdict, like nature pointing a finger and saying, you deserved what happened to you. But the longer I sat with it, the more uncomfortable I became. Not with the idea itself, but with how confidently we misunderstand it. Because most people hear that phrase and imagine strength, or intelligence, or discipline, or dominance. They imagine winners. But that's not what the phrase was ever meant to describe. And that misunderstanding has quietly shaped how we judge ourselves and others. In nature, fitness doesn't mean being the best. It means fitting. That's it. The organism that survives is not the strongest. It's not the bravest. It's not the most ambitious. It's the one that fits that specific environment at that specific moment. And environments are brutal in one particular way. They don't care about effort. They don't care about fairness. They don't care about intention. They just change. Think about this for a moment. A trait that helps you survive today can destroy you tomorrow. Speed helps until hiding matters more. Aggression helps until cooperation becomes essential. Obedience helps until creativity is required. Nature doesn't reward loyalty to traits. It rewards responsiveness, which means something unsettling. Fitness is temporary. And yet, look at how we talk about success in human systems. We treat success as proof of worth, failure as evidence of flaw, struggle as personal weakness. We forget that environments shift faster than people can adapt. We've taken a descriptive biological observation and turned it into a moral judgment. If you didn't survive, you weren't fit enough. That sentence sounds scientific, but it's actually cruel philosophy dressed as biology. Because it ignores context. It ignores starting points. It ignores invisible constraints. It ignores environments designed to benefit some and exhaust others. And worst of all, it teaches people to blame themselves for not fitting systems that were never built for them. One environment values constant visibility. Another rewards silence and patience. One demands speed. Another punishes it. You can't be fit for all of them at once. Yet we expect ourselves to be. We call it self-improvement. We call it discipline. We call it growth. But sometimes it's just self-erasure. Nature allows failure without shame. Species go extinct without being called lazy. Traits disappear without being mocked. Only humans moralize survival. Only humans turn adaptation into identity. Only humans say, if you didn't make it, something must be wrong with you. That belief doesn't come from evolution. It comes from systems that benefit when people internalize blame instead of questioning fit. It doesn't mean effort doesn't matter. It doesn't mean responsibility disappears. It means this: not fitting is not always failure. Sometimes it's information. Information that says this environment rewards something you're not built to provide. This structure values outcomes that cost you too much. This game measures the wrong things. And nature, if we listen carefully, has always whispered the same advice. Adapt, yes, but don't confuse adaptation with obedience. Once you see this, something shifts. You stop asking, why am I not strong enough? And start asking, strong for what? You stop chasing universal fitness. You start looking for alignment. Because survival isn't about becoming everything. It's about finding where you belong without disappearing. And that realization changes how you see struggle, success, and even yourself. There's something deeply human about certainty. It feels like safety, like standing on solid ground while the world shifts around you, like knowing what to do next without hesitation. And maybe that's why we're drawn to it, because uncertainty doesn't just confuse us, it unsettles us. It makes us feel exposed, small, out of control. So when we find an explanation that feels complete, we cling to it. Sometimes too tightly. At first, certainty looks responsible. Clear rules, clear plans, clear expectations. It looks like competence. But when you zoom out, when you look at how life actually behaves, a troubling pattern emerges. And adaptability, not certainty, is what keeps things alive. Think about evolution again. The organisms that survive longest are not the ones that are perfect. They're the ones that are flexible. Creatures that can tolerate variation, that can survive mistakes, that can respond when the environment shifts unexpectedly. In contrast, extreme specialization is fragile. It thrives beautifully until conditions change, and then it collapses. Human systems repeat this mistake constantly. We design schools as if all minds learn the same way. We design economies as if incentives work uniformly. We design laws as if human behavior is predictable. And when these systems fail, we don't say, our assumptions were limited. We say, people didn't follow the rules. That's where certainty turns dangerous. Because certainty doesn't invite feedback. It defends itself. It explains away failure instead of learning from it. When a model doesn't match reality, certainty doesn't adjust the model. It adjusts the narrative. You've probably seen this before. A policy that works in theory but quietly harms people in practice. A workplace rule that improves efficiency but erodes morale. A social norm that makes sense on paper but feels suffocating to live inside. And yet, it remains because it's certain. Documented, standardized, approved. Reality, meanwhile, is asked to cooperate. There's a subtle arrogance hiding inside certainty. The belief that once we understand something, we own it. That complexity can be flattened. That randomness can be ignored. That future behavior will resemble past data. But life doesn't reward that confidence. It punishes it, slowly. Most breakdowns don't arrive as explosions. They arrive as small mismatches. A rule that almost fits. A metric that captures most, but not all. A system that works for the average person and quietly breaks everyone else. Certainty ignores these edge cases. And over time, the edges become the center. What makes this especially dangerous is how convincing certainty feels. It reduces anxiety. It answers questions quickly. It tells us, this makes sense. This is under control. This is how things work. And our brains love that. Uncertainty requires effort, attention, humility. Certainty lets us relax. But here's the paradox. In complex systems, societies, ecosystems, human lives, relaxing too early is the mistake. True understanding increases awareness of what we don't know. The more you learn, the more cautious your claims become. That's not weakness. That's maturity. Notice the difference between wisdom and confidence. Confidence says, I know what will happen. Wisdom says, here's what usually happens, but I could be wrong. One closes the conversation. The other keeps it alive. This applies far beyond institutions. Look at personal life. How many conflicts come from certainty? I know why you did that. I know what this means. I know where this is going. And once certainty sets in, curiosity disappears. We stop asking. We start concluding. And often, we conclude wrong. Certainty doesn't just distort understanding. It shapes behavior. When you're certain, you stop listening. You stop noticing weak signals. You stop adapting. You enforce. And enforcement works until it doesn't. One of the hardest lessons in thinking is this. Systems that survive don't avoid mistakes. They absorb them. They bend. They adjust. They leave room for surprise. Certainty leaves no room. This is why the most resilient thinkers sound hesitant. They pause. They qualify. They resist clean conclusions. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they respect complexity. They know the world is not obligated to make sense. And maybe that's the real danger of certainty. Not that it's incorrect, but that it convinces us to stop looking. To stop asking, what am I missing? Who doesn't fit here? What breaks under pressure? Those questions feel uncomfortable, but they're the only ones that keep systems alive. We like to believe that things happen for a reason, that life rewards effort, that intelligence rises, that strength wins, that the best always survives. But Darwin's idea quietly dismantles all of that. Not loudly, not aggressively, just patiently. Because when you look closely at evolution, something unsettling appears. Not purpose, not fairness, not direction, but chance. And humans are deeply uncomfortable with that. Here's the mistake we keep making. We look at the world as it is now, complex, diverse, intelligent, and we assume it had to end up this way. We see birds with wings perfectly shaped for flight, eyes that see color, brains that think, dream, worry. And we tell ourselves a comforting story. This must be progress. This must be improvement. This must be destiny. But evolution doesn't work forward. It works backward. Only survivors remain to tell the story. Think about it for a moment. You are alive because an unbroken chain of organisms survived long enough to reproduce. That doesn't mean they were the strongest. It doesn't mean they were the smartest. It doesn't even mean they were better. It only means that in that specific moment, in that specific environment, they didn't die. That's it. No crown, no moral victory, no guarantee it would happen again. Here's where things get uncomfortable. A tiny environmental shift, a colder winter, a new disease, a drought, could erase an entire lineage. Not because it was flawed, but because it was unlucky. Evolution doesn't protect what works in general. It only protects what works right now. And right now is always changing. We often say survival of the fittest, but the phrase hides a dangerous illusion. Fitness doesn't mean superiority. Fitness means fit, compatible. Fit with the temperature, fit with available food, fit with predators, fit with parasites, fit with timing. Change one variable, and yesterday's winner becomes tomorrow's fossil. This is why evolution doesn't produce perfection. It produces good enough. Good enough to survive this moment. Good enough to reproduce once more. Good enough to continue the chain. Temporarily. There is no long-term plan. No final form. No destination waiting at the end. Now here's the part we rarely talk about. When we look back at evolution, everything appears inevitable. Of course mammals dominated. Of course humans emerged. Of course intelligence mattered. But that certainty is an illusion created by hindsight. If we rewound life and pressed play again, the outcome would almost certainly be different. Not slightly different, radically different. Different dominant species, different body plans, different intelligence, or maybe none at all. And this realization quietly challenges something deeper. If evolution is chance, then success is not proof of worth. Survival is not proof of superiority. Existence is not proof of destiny. It's proof of continuation. Nothing more. This idea makes people uneasy because we like meaning that feels earned. We like to believe we are here because we deserve to be. But Darwin's insight whispers something colder and strangely liberating. You are not the result of a plan. You are the result of survival. And survival is not moral. This is also why evolution doesn't care about suffering. Nature doesn't feel cruelty. It doesn't reward kindness. It doesn't punish arrogance. It only filters. Those who pass through exist. Those who don't disappear. No explanation required. And yet, despite this randomness, something fascinating happens. Life continues to adapt. Not wisely, not intentionally, but persistently. Every generation experiments blindly. Most experiments fail. A few don't, and those few shape the next moment. This is where humans often misunderstand Darwin. They hear chance and assume meaninglessness. But that's not what this is. This isn't nihilism. It's humility. It's the understanding that life didn't choose us. It simply didn't eliminate us yet. And that realization changes how we see ourselves. If evolution isn't destiny, then neither is hierarchy, nor entitlement, nor inevitability. It means complexity is fragile, civilizations are temporary, and dominance is always conditional. And maybe that's the most important lesson here. Not that life is meaningless, but that certainty is an illusion we invent to feel safe. Evolution never promised safety, only continuation. For now. If evolution had a sound, it wouldn't be loud. No explosions, no dramatic turning points, no moment where nature announces something new is happening now. It would be almost silent. Because the most powerful force driving life forward is also the easiest to overlook. Variation. Not the big, obvious differences we like to talk about, strength, intelligence, beauty, but the small ones, the tiny, almost invisible differences that most people would never notice unless they were looking very closely. Darwin noticed something simple, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. No two organisms are exactly the same, not even twins, not even siblings born minutes apart, not even plants growing side by side in the same soil under the same sun. At first, this feels obvious, trivial even. Of course things are different, so what? But Darwin realized something deeper. Those differences aren't noise. They're not mistakes. They're not imperfections in an otherwise perfect design. They are the engine. Think about it. If every organism were identical, truly identical, then when conditions changed, they would all succeed or all fail together. There would be no flexibility, no buffer, no escape. Sameness is fragile. Difference is resilience. A slightly thicker fur, a beak curved just a little more, a tolerance for heat that's barely noticeable, a habit of eating at a different time of day. None of these traits look heroic on their own. None of them scream future survivor. But when the environment shifts, when food becomes scarce, when predators arrive, when the climate changes, those small differences suddenly matter more than any grand trait. And here's the unsettling part. Variation doesn't appear because life needs it. There's no intention behind it. Nature doesn't say, "Let me try something new." Evolution doesn't plan ahead. Life doesn't innovate with foresight. Variation simply happens. Randomly. Constantly. Without concern for usefulness. Most variations are useless. Many are harmful. Some make no difference at all. But occasionally, quietly, one of them fits. Not perfectly, just enough. And that's all survival ever requires. Perfection is unnecessary. In fact, a perfectly optimized organism for today is often the least prepared for tomorrow, because tomorrow is never guaranteed to look like today. That's why evolution doesn't chase perfection. It tolerates messiness. It allows inefficiency. It keeps options open. Variation is not progress. It's insurance. We like to believe that success comes from being the best, the strongest, the smartest, the most optimized. But evolution doesn't reward best. It rewards fit. And fit is temporary. The trait that helps today might hurt tomorrow. The advantage that dominates one environment becomes irrelevant in another. That's why sameness is evolutionary death. When everyone is built the same way, everyone shares the same weakness. Difference spreads risk. This is why monocultures collapse, why genetically identical crops fail together, why uniform systems break catastrophically. Nature learned this lesson long before humans did. Variation keeps life flexible. And importantly, this flexibility doesn't come from intelligence or awareness. Organisms don't know they are different. They don't understand their advantages. They don't adapt consciously. They simply exist as they are, and the environment does the rest. No judgment, no fairness, no reward for effort, just quiet filtering. Those slightly better suited remain. Those slightly worse suited fade out. Not because they were wrong, but because difference happened to land elsewhere. This is why big change never starts big. There is no leap from nothing to something extraordinary. There is only a small difference, followed by time. And then another small difference, and more time. Until looking back, it feels like something dramatic must have happened. But it didn't. It just started slightly different. And that was enough. If variation is the spark, inheritance is the quiet hand that carries it forward. Not carefully, not thoughtfully, not with any understanding of where things are going, just forward. Darwin realized that difference alone isn't enough. A trait can appear once and disappear just as easily. For change to last, something else must happen. The difference has to be passed on. This is where many people instinctively imagine intention, as if nature selects traits the way a human breeder might, as if there's a hidden logic deciding what deserves to continue. But Darwin stripped that illusion away. Inheritance has no foresight. Offspring resemble their parents not because nature wants them to, but because that's simply how reproduction works. Structures, tendencies, behaviors, they echo forward because they're physically connected to what came before. Nothing more, nothing less. And crucially, resemblance is never exact. If children were perfect copies of their parents, evolution would stall. There would be repetition, not change. But inheritance is imperfect by nature. It copies with variation built in. Close, but never precise. That imperfection is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Nature doesn't design traits. It doesn't test them. It doesn't refine them toward a goal. It passes them on blindly. Some traits that are harmful still get passed on simply because the organism survives long enough to reproduce. Some traits that are beneficial disappear because the organism never gets the chance. There is no moral logic here, no preference for good traits, no rejection of bad ones, only transmission. This is one of Darwin's most unsettling ideas. Good traits don't spread because they are good. They spread because they make it through. A trait might be useful, but if it interferes with reproduction, it ends. A trait might be harmful, but if it doesn't prevent reproduction, it continues. Survival isn't about quality, it's about continuity. Inheritance doesn't ask, is this efficient? Is this beautiful? Is this optimal? It only asks one question. Did it pass? And even that question isn't asked consciously. It's answered silently after the fact. This is why evolution feels cruel when viewed emotionally. Traits that cause suffering can persist. Traits that feel unfair can spread. Nature doesn't correct itself according to human values. It corrects itself only through persistence. And because inheritance is blind, evolution has no memory. It doesn't remember past success. It doesn't preserve wisdom. It doesn't avoid previous mistakes. Each generation starts fresh, carrying forward whatever happened to survive last time, even if the environment has already changed. That's why organisms often seem poorly designed, why bodies carry inefficiencies, why solutions feel improvised rather than elegant. Evolution is not an engineer. It's a chain reaction. Variation appears. Inheritance carries it forward. The environment filters it. Again and again. No intention, no destination, just continuity. And this is the moment Darwin quietly undermines one of humanity's favorite beliefs, that progress requires purpose. It doesn't. Change happens without knowing where it's going. Life advances not because it aims higher, but because it keeps moving, and whatever manages to stay in motion stays in existence. There's a phrase everyone knows: natural selection. It sounds active, intentional, almost intelligent, as if nature is watching, judging, choosing winners and losers. But Darwin never meant it that way. In fact, the phrase itself is misleading, because nature does not select anything. It filters. That difference matters more than it seems. Selection implies a chooser, a preference, a goal. Filtering implies something else entirely: a passive process. No judgment, no intention, no awareness. The environment doesn't look at organisms and decide who deserves to survive. It doesn't reward strength. It doesn't punish weakness. It doesn't even notice. It simply exists. And life either fits within it, or it doesn't. This is why natural selection is such a dangerous metaphor. It smuggles intelligence into a process that has none. Nature is not a judge, not a planner, not a designer. It's closer to a landscape than a mind. Think of a flood. The water doesn't choose which structures to destroy. It doesn't aim for weak buildings. It doesn't hate poorly built houses. It rises. And whatever can't withstand it disappears. Not because it was judged, but because it didn't fit the conditions. That's how natural selection works. The environment changes. Climate, food sources, predators, disease, competition. And organisms are exposed to those conditions. Most fail. Quietly. Without drama. This is another uncomfortable truth Darwin uncovered. The overwhelming majority of life does not adapt. It disappears. Extinction is not rare. It's normal. For every lineage that continues, countless others end. Not because they were inferior in some absolute sense, but because the conditions shifted just enough to push them out. No reward ceremony, no lesson learned, no correction made. Just absence. We often tell the story backwards. We look at what survived and say, this trait was selected because it was superior. But that's hindsight. Survival doesn't prove optimality. It proves compatibility with a specific moment in a specific environment. Change the conditions, and yesterday's success becomes tomorrow's liability. That's why evolution doesn't move toward perfection. It moves toward fit, temporary fit, fragile fit, fit that lasts only until the environment changes again. This also dismantles the myth of nature as an intelligent force. Nature doesn't favor intelligence. It doesn't prefer cooperation. It doesn't value complexity. Those traits survive only when, and only if, they happen to work right now. Sometimes brute simplicity survives longer than elegance. Sometimes fragility outlasts strength. Sometimes randomness wins. There is no narrative arc, no progress guarantee, no moral dimension. Natural selection is not about rewarding the best. It's about eliminating what fails. And elimination is silent. You don't hear about the species that almost made it. You don't see the adaptations that were good, but not good enough. You don't notice the countless forms of life that existed briefly and vanished without trace. Evolution doesn't celebrate success, it forgets failure. And because we only see what remains, we mistake survival for intention. But Darwin's insight was colder and clearer. Life doesn't advance because it's guided. It advances because it's filtered, again and again. And whatever passes through the filter continues. Everything else simply stops. After understanding that nature doesn't choose, another illusion quietly falls apart. The illusion of understanding. When we look at an organism perfectly suited to its environment, it's almost impossible not to think, it must know what it's doing. But that feeling comes from us, not from the organism. Adaptation does not require awareness, not even a little. An organism does not know it is adapted. It does not know it is surviving. It does not know it is part of a process at all. It simply exists, acts, reacts, and either continues or disappears. There is no learning built into evolution itself. Learning happens inside individual lifetimes. Evolution happens across lifetimes. That distinction is crucial. A bird does not grow thicker feathers because it understands winter. Thicker feathered birds already existed. When the climate shifted, those birds happened to survive more often. No plan was formed, no strategy was chosen, no realization occurred. From the outside, the result looks intentional. From the inside, nothing changed. This is why adaptation feels deceptive. Traits appear designed, structures appear optimized, behaviors appear purposeful. But appearance is created by survival bias. We only see what worked. Everything that didn't is gone, erased so completely that it never enters the picture. Design is what we infer when failure is invisible. That's why purpose feels obvious even when none exists. Evolution doesn't move toward goals, it moves away from incompatibility, again and again. And because movement away from failure can resemble movement toward function, we mistake the process for intelligence. But intelligence is optional in evolution. Simple organisms adapt without minds. Plants adapt without awareness. Bacteria adapt without perception. No nervous system is required, which means intelligence is not the engine of evolution. It's just one of many traits that sometimes helps. Sometimes. In some environments. For a while. This reframes intelligence itself. Intelligence is not nature's crowning achievement. It's a gamble. A costly trait that only survives when the environment rewards flexibility, learning, and prediction. In stable environments, intelligence can be unnecessary, even disadvantageous. Complexity burns energy. Awareness invites distraction. Cognition introduces failure modes. Evolution doesn't prefer smart organisms. It prefers adequate ones. This is another uncomfortable realization. Humans didn't rise because intelligence is inherently superior. Intelligence happened to work under certain pressures: social complexity, tool use, communication. Remove those pressures, and intelligence loses its advantage. There is no universal ranking of traits, only local usefulness. And usefulness has no memory. This is why evolution produces organisms that look brilliantly engineered and strangely inefficient at the same time. Because nothing is redesigned from scratch. Adaptation builds on what already exists. It modifies, it patches, it repurposes, never stopping to ask whether the overall structure makes sense. Survival doesn't require elegance. It requires persistence. And persistence doesn't require understanding. That's the final illusion Darwin quietly dismantled here. Life does not know why it works. It simply works. Until It doesn't. After learning that adaptation doesn't require awareness, another assumption quietly dissolves: the idea that evolution is going somewhere. From our position in time, it feels obvious. Life started simple, life became complex. Eventually, intelligence appeared, and here we are. That sequence feels like progress, but that feeling comes from perspective, not from the process itself. We are standing at one end of the timeline looking backward, mistaking survival for improvement. Evolution does not climb. It does not advance. It does not upgrade. It persists. The reason evolution feels like progress is simple. We notice complexity more than simplicity. A single-celled organism doesn't impress us. A brain does. But attention is not a measure of success. Longevity is. And by that standard, complexity is not winning. Bacteria appeared billions of years ago. They are still here. They inhabit almost every environment on Earth. They survive extremes that would instantly kill complex organisms. They reproduce rapidly, adapt quickly, and require minimal resources. By any evolutionary metric that matters, numbers, endurance, adaptability, bacteria are astonishingly successful. They didn't fail to become something else. They succeeded at staying what they are. Complex organisms, by contrast, are fragile. They need narrow conditions. They depend on stable environments. They break easily. The more complex a system becomes, the more ways it can fail. Complexity introduces vulnerability, which means evolution does not reward complexity. It tolerates it temporarily when conditions allow. Intelligence fits this pattern. We often treat intelligence as evolution's masterpiece, as if life was trying to arrive at thought, self-awareness, culture. But intelligence is just one strategy among many. It's expensive. It consumes energy. It requires long development. It depends on social structures that can collapse. In many environments, intelligence is useless. A bacterium doesn't need foresight. A fungus doesn't need planning. A plant doesn't need consciousness. They survive without knowing they exist. Intelligence only works when uncertainty, variability, and social interaction make prediction valuable. Remove those pressures, and intelligence becomes excess weight. This is why evolution produces no universal ladder. There is no higher life in absolute terms, only life that fits, here, now, briefly. From our human perspective, the past looks like a march toward us. But that's because we're looking backward from survival. Everything that didn't lead here disappeared, and what remains creates the illusion of direction. This is survivorship bias written into biology itself. We are not the goal of evolution. We are one outcome that hasn't ended yet. And this reframing matters, because when we believe evolution is progress, we project that belief onto ourselves. We assume more complexity means better lives, more intelligence means superiority, more sophistication means advancement. But biology doesn't support that story. Survival beats sophistication, again and again. The simplest systems last longest because they have fewer reasons to collapse. Evolution does not admire complexity. It merely allows it until the environment changes. And environments always change. Once we let go of the idea that evolution is progress, another image has to go with it: the ladder. Most of us, without realizing it, picture evolution as a straight vertical climb. At the bottom, simple life. Above it, fish, reptiles, mammals. Near the top, primates. And finally, at the highest rung, humans. It feels natural to think this way. It flatters us. It makes our existence feel earned. But this picture is wrong. Evolution is not a ladder. It's a tree. And trees don't climb upward toward a goal. They branch outward in every direction. Some branches grow long, some stay short. Some split repeatedly, some end abruptly. Most branches die. That's the real structure of life. When Darwin first sketched his ideas, he didn't draw a ladder. He drew branching diagrams, lines splitting, diverging, ending. No higher, no lower, just divergence. The ladder model survives because our minds like hierarchy. Up feels better than down. Higher feels superior to lower. But biology doesn't recognize rank. There is no universal scale where a bacterium scores low and a human scores high. Each organism is adapted to its niche, not competing for a single throne. A shark is not a failed human. A moss plant is not an incomplete animal. A bacterium is not primitive in any meaningful sense. They are not ancestors waiting to become us. They are contemporaries, alive now, successful now, optimized for conditions we could not survive. The tree model explains something the ladder can't: dead ends. Most evolutionary paths don't lead anywhere dramatic. They lead to specialization. A species adapts narrowly. It becomes extremely good at one thing. Then conditions change, and that branch ends. Extinction is not failure in evolution. It's normal. More than 99% of all species that ever lived are gone. Not replaced, not upgraded. Gone. If evolution were a ladder, we would expect constant upward movement. But what we actually see is branching, stalling, looping, collapsing. Life explores possibilities. It doesn't refine toward perfection. And humans are no exception. We didn't reach the top. We arrived at one branch that happened to support large brains, language, cooperation, and culture for now. That branch could split, or shrink, or end. Nothing in evolution promises permanence. This is uncomfortable to accept because the ladder gives us meaning. It suggests destiny, direction, importance. The tree offers none of that. It offers contingency. We are here because of countless accidents layered on top of survival. Climate shifts, mass extinctions, random mutations, geographic isolation. Change one detail, and this branch never forms. So, when we say humans are the most evolved, what we really mean is humans are the most evolved for the specific conditions that allowed humans to appear. That's not supremacy. That's circumstance. Seeing life as a tree doesn't diminish us. It humbles us. It removes the illusion that the universe was building toward us. And in doing so, it frees us from a dangerous assumption that we are entitled to the future. We are not on top of anything. We are standing on a thin branch surrounded by others, all swaying in the same unpredictable wind. Once you see life as a tree instead of a ladder, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. Most branches don't survive. We talk about evolution as if survival is normal, as if life tends to persist unless something goes wrong, but the opposite is true. Extinction is not the exception. Extinction is the rule. Survival is rare continuity. For every species alive today, there are thousands that once existed and no longer do. They didn't all disappear in dramatic catastrophes. Most didn't get wiped out by meteors or ice ages. They faded. Quietly. A temperature shifted. A food source declined. A competitor arrived. A parasite adapted faster. No explosion, no warning, just fewer births than deaths until none remained. Evolution doesn't punish failure. It doesn't reward success. It simply allows what works right now to continue and removes everything else without comment. That indifference is hard for us to accept because we instinctively attach meaning to survival. If something lasted a long time, we assume it must have been superior. But longevity in evolution doesn't equal excellence. It equals compatibility with conditions that happen to persist. Consider dominance. At different points in Earth's history, dominance belonged to very different forms of life. For millions of years, giant insects ruled oxygen-rich skies. Then, oxygen dropped, and they vanished. Dinosaurs dominated land for over 160 million years. Then, the climate shifted, and almost all of them disappeared. Reef systems flourished for ages. Then, oceans warmed or acidified, and they collapsed. Dominance never protects a species. It often makes extinction more likely because specialization reduces flexibility. The more tightly adapted you are to a specific world, the more fragile you become when that world changes. Success builds dependence, and dependence invites collapse. This is why evolution doesn't care about legacy. A species can thrive for millions of years and still vanish without descendants. There is no memory in the system, no honor for past survival, no reward for previous success, only continuation or disappearance. Even traits that look unbeatable don't last. Speed, size, strength, intelligence, all of them become liabilities under the wrong conditions. Evolution doesn't ask, how impressive is this species? It asks only one question over and over. Does this still work? If the answer becomes no, the branch ends, no matter how long it lasted, no matter how dominant it once was. This applies to us too, whether we like it or not. Human intelligence, technology, culture, these are not guarantees of permanence. They are strategies. And strategies only remain valid while conditions support them. Evolution offers no promises. It does not aim for progress. It does not preserve achievements. It does not protect success stories. It only filters. What survives does so temporarily. What fails disappears permanently. And the process moves on without regret. This isn't pessimism, it's clarity. Understanding extinction as the norm strips evolution of drama and replaces it with honesty. Life is not a heroic march forward. It is a fragile, ongoing experiment where continuity is rare, temporary, and always conditional. After understanding extinction, one illusion quietly collapses. The idea that humans stand outside the rules. We often talk about evolution as something that happened to everything else, animals, plants, microbes, and then somehow stopped when it reached us. As if intelligence ended the process. As if culture replaced biology. As if consciousness granted immunity. It didn't. Humans are not an exception. We are participants. Every trait we value, intelligence, empathy, morality, creativity, aggression, did not appear because they were noble. They appeared because at some point they helped survival or reproduction. Nothing more, nothing less. Our brains didn't evolve to understand truth. They evolved to navigate environments, to predict danger, to secure resources, to maintain alliances, to compete when necessary. Even our most abstract capacities, storytelling, ethics, philosophy, sit on top of much older biological machinery. Morality didn't descend from the sky. It emerged from cooperation. Groups that could trust internally survived better than groups that couldn't. Individuals who followed shared rules avoided constant conflict. Emotions like guilt and shame discouraged behaviors that threatened group stability. Morality wasn't designed to be right. It was shaped to be useful. Aggression followed the same logic. It wasn't selected because violence is evil or good. It was selected because in some contexts it worked. Defending territory, protecting offspring, deterring rivals. At the same time, cooperation evolved right alongside it. Humans didn't evolve to be peaceful or violent. We evolved to be flexible, capable of both, depending on circumstances. This is why moral behavior changes across cultures and eras, not because humans are confused, but because evolution favors adaptability, not consistency. Even intelligence, our proudest trait, is not a destiny. It is a strategy, a powerful one, but still conditional. Intelligence helped humans manipulate environments, solve problems, and transmit knowledge across generations. But intelligence doesn't override biology. It amplifies it. Our desires, fears, biases, and instincts still shape how intelligence is used. We don't reason from neutral ground. We reason from evolved drives. That's why intelligence can build medicine and weapons, why it can foster cooperation and exploitation, why it can create meaning and rationalize cruelty. Culture doesn't erase biology, it channels it. Culture is not a replacement system, it is a layer built on top of ancient mechanisms. We still feel fear before we analyze, desire before we justify, tribal loyalty before abstract ethics. We are not blank slates. We are deeply shaped organisms pretending to be detached thinkers. This doesn't mean humans are trapped. It means freedom has limits. We can reflect. We can resist some impulses. We can design systems that reduce harm. But we cannot pretend we are outside evolution. Every society, every ideology, every moral system still competes within the same filtering process. What spreads survives. What fails disappears. Not because it was wrong, but because it didn't fit. Recognizing that humans obey the same rules as all life doesn't make us smaller. It makes us clearer. We stop mistaking biology for destiny and culture for escape. And we start seeing ourselves as what we truly are. A temporary branch using intelligence to navigate forces far older than reason. There is a moment where understanding turns dangerous. Not because the idea is wrong, but because people start using it for things it was never meant to do. Darwin explained how life changes. He did not explain how humans should behave. That confusion between what happens and what ought to happen is where trouble begins. The phrase survival of the fittest didn't even come from Darwin originally. It came later. And it stuck not because it was accurate, but because it sounded powerful. Fittest was quietly reinterpreted to mean stronger, smarter, richer, more dominant, more deserving. But that was never the biological meaning. In evolution, fit doesn't mean better. It means better matched to a specific environment at a specific moment. A parasite is fit. A bacterium is fit. A species that survives quietly for millions of years without changing is fit. Fitness has no moral quality. It does not reward virtue. It does not punish weakness. It does not admire strength. It simply filters. And yet, people turned this neutral process into an ideology. Social Darwinism was born when biology was dragged into politics, economics, and power structures. The logic went like this. If nature eliminates the weak, then helping the weak is unnatural. If success proves fitness, then failure proves inferiority. If inequality exists, it must be justified. This was never Darwin's claim. Darwin described patterns. Others turned those patterns into permission. That difference matters. Darwin never argued that suffering was good. He never claimed cruelty was necessary. He never said evolution should guide morality. He showed that nature doesn't care. Humans were the ones who did. And that's the critical distinction. Description is not prescription. Science explains what happens. It does not tell us what to value. Evolution explains how traits spread. It does not justify how we treat each other. Gravity explains why things fall. It doesn't tell you to push someone off a cliff. But when evolutionary ideas entered social systems, many forgot this boundary. Biology was used to rationalize colonialism, racism, eugenics, economic exploitation, all under the false belief that nature had spoken when it hadn't. Nature doesn't speak. Humans speak for it. And often they speak conveniently. Darwin's work actually undermines arrogance, not supports it. It shows that dominance is temporary, that success has no guarantee, that extinction doesn't care about achievement, that complexity can vanish overnight. If anything, evolution is a warning against moral certainty. It shows us how fragile survival is, how context-dependent success becomes, how easily conditions shift. Misreading Darwin turns humility into hierarchy. Understanding Darwin correctly does the opposite. It strips away the illusion that biology gives us moral authority. It reminds us that ethics are human constructions, choices, not laws of nature. And that means responsibility returns to us. We can't hide behind biology. We can't say nature wanted this. Nature doesn't want. It doesn't intend. It doesn't justify. It only filters. What we do with that knowledge, how we treat others once we understand it, is not an evolutionary question. It's a human one. For many people, Darwin feels like a theft, not of belief, but of reassurance. Because before evolution, meaning came from above, from design, from purpose written into the universe itself. You mattered because you were intended. And Darwin disrupted that story. He showed a world that wasn't planned, only shaped. A process without foresight. A history without intention. For some, that feels like emptiness. If we weren't designed, if life has no built-in goal, if existence is not aiming at anything, then what's left? But that reaction assumes something quietly mistaken. It assumes meaning must be given to be real. Darwin didn't remove meaning, he relocated it. Before Darwin, meaning was external. After Darwin, meaning becomes something else entirely. It becomes human. Life without cosmic design doesn't mean life without value. It means value is no longer imposed. There is no script you're failing to follow, no destiny you're obligated to fulfill, no invisible standard watching your progress. And strangely, that absence creates responsibility. When meaning is given, you obey it. When meaning is absent, you must decide. That's not nihilism. That's freedom with weight. Evolution explains how you arrived here, not what you should do now that you are. It tells you why eyes see, why fear protects, why cooperation evolved. But it does not tell you what deserves loyalty, or love, or sacrifice. Those choices remain yours. Understanding evolution doesn't reduce value. It strips away illusion. It shows that life is rare not because it was planned, but because it survived countless ways of not existing. Every organism alive is a survivor of an unbroken chain stretching back billions of years, not chosen, not favored, just uninterrupted. That fact doesn't cheapen life, it intensifies it. There is no cosmic safety net ensuring things turn out meaningful. Meaning exists only where someone insists on it. Care exists only where someone cares. Purpose exists only where someone commits to it. This is uncomfortable because certainty collapses, but something else opens. You no longer live to satisfy a design. You live to decide what matters. Evolution doesn't tell you that life is pointless. It tells you that purpose isn't guaranteed, and that makes it fragile, and therefore precious. Meaning after Darwin is quieter. It doesn't come with commands. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It doesn't justify itself automatically. It has to be chosen again and again. Not because the universe demands it, but because you do. And maybe that's the most honest meaning available. Not inherited, not enforced, not promised, but created, deliberately, in a world that doesn't owe us one. One of the most subtle misunderstandings about evolution is that it already happened, that it belongs to fossils, to textbooks, to the past. But evolution isn't a story we finished telling. It's a process still speaking, slowly, quietly, without asking for attention. Nothing in biology ever arrives. It only continues. There was never a final form. No moment where life said, "This is good enough, we can stop now." Every organism alive today is temporary, including us. Not flawed, not unfinished in a tragic sense, just provisional. Humans often imagine evolution as a ladder behind us. We climbed it, we reached intelligence, we stepped off. But that's not how it works. Evolution doesn't retire species. It doesn't reward success with permanence. It keeps filtering. Humans are still evolving, just not in ways we easily notice. Our bodies change slowly. Our genes drift quietly. Small differences still appear, still pass on, still vanish. But something new has entered the process. Culture. Tools, language, medicine, technology, these don't replace evolution. They interact with it. They change the environment faster than biology can respond. They reshape what survives, who reproduces, what matters. We altered the filter. And that doesn't end evolution. It complicates it. Traits that once mattered fade. New pressures emerge. Biology and culture tug at each other, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. There is no stable endpoint waiting ahead. No final human version, no perfected state. Every solution creates new problems. Every adaptation opens new vulnerabilities. Every advantage depends on conditions that won't last. That's not failure. That's how life works. Evolution is not progress toward an ideal. It's continuity under change. What survives today may fail tomorrow. What seems fragile now may endure. The future doesn't belong to the strongest, the smartest, or the most advanced. It belongs to whatever fits conditions that don't yet exist. And those conditions are coming, whether we prepare for them or not. Darwin didn't give us a story with an ending. He gave us a lens, a way to see life not as finished objects, but as ongoing negotiations with reality. Nothing final, nothing guaranteed, nothing complete. Just forms that last, until they don't. And maybe that's the most honest conclusion possible. There is no final version, only the next moment that survives. And that's it for today, my friend. You were listening to Wise Alchemy. The story ends here for now, but you and I, we'll meet again. Thank you.